So for me, the first principle is that development is not about taking risks, it's about managing risks. Yeah, so Andy and I did this last year, and we sort of did it as a bit of a review of the day, and just to try and explore and extract the maximum value out of all of the things that people have discussed, and I think it worked really well. So we thought, let's do it again this year. Yeah.
So starting off, first thing of the day was Jay and Piotr, was the first session I saw, and one of the things I think Jay said was managing risk. If it's risky, you're not doing it right, and I think risk's a big part of development. So as we go into this year, 2020, what are the things that us as developers we should be thinking about in terms of managing our risk?
So for me, the first principle is that development is not about taking risks. If you're going to be a good developer, you want to be a risk controller, not a risk taker. So what that means is doing everything that you can to make sure you're not caught off guard by anything. So understanding what the possible things are that could go wrong, make sure that you put an allowance in for them, if possible, work out what the precise cost of fixing that thing is. Build more margin into your projects if you can. So planning enhancement is a great way of reducing risk. Mm-hmm. And we had a whole panel on planning enhancement. So I think if you can increase the end value and the profit in your development through planning enhancement, it's a great way of de-risking it, because it means if you do come across something that's unexpected or that you hadn't forecast, there's more margin for error, more room to absorb it. And I think Jay and Piotr talked about that in their presentation. I think the other thing is, don't just have one plan. Have 7 plans, have 8 plans, have 10 plans if you can. The point is, if your plan A doesn't work and there's some risk that could go wrong, you need to have a fallback. And if the fallback doesn't work, you need to have another fallback. So with our Clapham Road project, we ran 8 different scenarios on that before we exchanged contracts, so that we knew that if we couldn't get what we were targeting, we had another plan that we could pursue, and if that didn't work, we had another plan that we could pursue, and we ran all of those scenarios back to the point where we looked at the absolute worst case, which is that we couldn't get anything more than was already approved on site. And it wasn't until we did that we exchanged contracts on the project. So that's about minimising risk and having other places to go if your plan A doesn't work.
So multiple exits.
That's a really key fundamental principle of development. That's about how you minimise risk.
Okay. Let me ask you about Help to Buy, because that was mentioned a few times today as well. Obviously, Help to Buy is coming to an end in, I think, 2023. What should we as developers be doing now to make sure that we're ready for if that ceases? How do we change? How do we innovate, to use Stuart's terminology, to make sure that our product is safe? We've got multiple exits. We're not relying on Help to Buy.
So I think it's very unlikely that Help to Buy will actually be cut off.
Okay.
I do. I think the government can't afford to cut it off because it's supporting the new home market to such an extent. If you looked at KFH's stats, I think they were saying 80% of their sales were Help to Buy sales. I mean, I didn't realise the proportion that was that high in London. You can see that if that stopped, the market would pretty much come to a halt. You know, when people aren't buying things, people aren't selling things, and and the market just slows down. So I think, if anything, it's like if they do decide to phase it out, and I don't think they will, but then they're likely to phase it out gently, because I'm sure that the government realised the massive impact that would have on the housing market, and I think particularly a Conservative government who tend to have more of a sensible eye on economics than maybe a Labour government might. So I think it's unlikely that it'll be phased out. But to answer your question about what should developers do about it, I think one thing that you can do is look at alternative use classes. So residential is not the only way to use a building, particularly in London. You can look at things like co-living, or you can look at hotel or apart hotel uses. You can look at office use. So one of the things that we've done in the last 12 months particularly is pivoted our business towards commercial, and that means that we're not exposed to a residential sector, which at the moment is not particularly reliable.
Having said that, it was encouraging to hear John from KFH talking about the Boris bounce and that slight upturn in terms of the number of inquiries, both from a sales and a lettings perspective, which must be the first signs, perhaps, that things are looking a bit rosier.
I think it's likely that we'll have a good year in residential. because people have been holding back. The uncertainty about what will happen with Brexit has been holding back investment. It's been holding back people moving. And so I think as that starts to unwind, it's likely that the next 12 months will be good. That wouldn't stop Help to Buy crashing the market if the scheme was pulled. But as I said, I don't think it's likely that it will be.
Okay. The next point was from Bruce and Sam, who were talking about from Bond Finance, talking about how to present a case to a lender. And I think Stuart and maybe also Grant talked about telling a story, both from in terms of raising investment, but also getting planning. What can we learn from? What are the things that have worked well for you as you're building your brand?
Yeah, I think you need to think about how you present your track record to lenders in particular. What I was going to go on to say is that we do have to do that to a larger extent now with investors rather than lenders necessarily. I think in terms of planning, it's also important to focus on telling the story. The way that what you include in a planning application can make it much more persuasive for planners. So a big thing is sustainability. If you put forward a scheme that is carbon neutral or low carbon, is environmentally sustainable, has an attractive design by a good architect, you're more likely to get a consent. We did this on our site in Hythe in Kent. We used Guy Holloway, who's a really well-reputed local architect. He does modern style designs. He did the Ashford Town Centre regeneration, a big multiplex cinema, hundreds of flats there, all very modern style. And the local planning authority looked more favourably upon our application because it had his name as the architect on the plans, because they know the quality of the stuff that he does. And so I think if you can get something that you can get the planning authority to get behind, you increase your chances of getting an approval. And it can be worth spending a bit more money to do that, to deliver something high quality and selling the benefits of it to the planning authority.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've got an architectural practice and we're working on a scheme that is being designed to passive house standards, and that's being received very well by the local authority.
Definitely. So, and particularly with what's going on in Australia at the moment, it's a real hot topic. I mean, that was a bit of a pun, but unintended, but still, it is.
Okay, so moving on from jokes about Australia and fires, let's talk about price of finance. So Daryl, Karen, and Stephen from Lendwell, talked about the price of finance is not always the key metric when you're looking to get some finance. And they talked about you might pay more for your finance, but it'll outperform the bank. You might find better deals, but pay more for the finance that'll work better from an ROI perspective. So when you're looking at finance, what are the key things that you look for when you're looking at borrowing?
I think the finance has to fit the deal, but the key message, I think, and this is something that I've looked at from the outset, is the return on the capital that I put into the deal. So it isn't the percentage interest rate or the fees on the finance, it's the return that you get out of the deal based on the amount of capital that you put in, return on capital employed. But I think the thing to remember about that is that in a market that goes the wrong way, leverage works against you. In a market that goes the right way, leverage works for you. So higher leverage is more risky. But it does turbocharge your returns in the event that things go as planned or the market improves. So just bear in mind that risk-reward balance, and also I guess if you end up with a delay and you have higher interest rates, then that's going to cost you more. So that's something else that's worth thinking about. But I think if you've got a project where you've got a high degree of certainty on the exit, where you've got a strong market for sales of the units that you're developing, or you've got a pre-sale, then it makes sense to look at your return on capital employed.
Okay. So after that, we had the panel on prime development. I liked what, I think it was Gillian was talking around, income plays are a big opportunity. They're safe bets. I think she's talking about build to rent there, all those kind of schemes, right, as opposed to build to sell.
Yeah, and so, I mean, in my business is not property development, it's property development and investment. And so we do both, and we blend it. We tend to hold on to stuff where you've got a good rental return, and we sell stuff where the rental return is not so good. There is generally a trade-off actually in the market. If your rental return is higher, usually the capital gains that you're going to get are going to be lower. If your rental returns are lower, it's normally the other way around. So the rental returns in London are generally very low, but in the long run, capital gains tend to be higher. So I think it's worth having a balanced portfolio with a bit of each of those kind of things in if you're thinking about investment.
I think balance is the key thing there, isn't it? Absolutely. Yeah. I quite like the sentiment there. Brexit, so what earlier? A bit of a battle cry. Who cares? Brexit, schmexit was good. Then there was the opportunity of developing for the over 55s. Richard Bowser was talking about this, and he spoke about it last year as well. The changing demographic creates opportunity for us as developers and investors that we perhaps aren't exploiting yet.
Yeah, no, he's only thinking about that because he wants somewhere to live. Sorry, joking. But, no, is he here? No. So no, it's true. I mean, the baby boom is, it's a big wave, and it's a big wave of money. Actually, that's that big wave of births that happened at a particular time. That's now coming into 55 plus, 60. Those people have a lot of money because they invested in property. It was during a relatively good economic time, and there's a lot of purchasing power there. And as that moves into the system, it's going to put a lot of strain on the healthcare system. That potentially will create more demand for things like care homes and for perhaps assisted living. I think there's going to be a big opportunity there. But I think, and I think there is an opportunity for developers and investors in looking at markets which appeal to that particular sector, because it's going to grow and it's going to become more important, particularly in the next decade.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with that long-term perspective, we moved on to talking about sustainability, and Ben's a really good presentation, emphasising the importance of designing with the future in mind. The future home standard that's around the corner, I think, is going to be really important for us all to think about as we're moving into new schemes. And then the importance of the triple bottom line that Nicola introduced as well. I think it was Nicola from Box Creative. All of that messaging there is so important now, isn't it? I know there was a reference a minute ago to the bushfires, but it's such a big topic for us to think about as developers.
Well, it's starting to be mandated by planning. It's starting to be demanded by buyers. Buyers are more interested in being environmentally conscious and will pay more for a house that does. The government is bringing in things like, for example, a requirement for new homes to have a charging point for electric cars that will come in. Gas boilers are going to be phased out, so we're going to need to think about things like ground source and air source heating, stuff that's more environmentally sustainable. But also, I think there's also a really strong social pressure. I think developers who don't make an attempt to be carbon neutral and environmentally sustainable are going to come in for a lot of criticism. And so I think there's an advantage and maybe even a marketing advantage in leading the way on that front.
Yeah, no question there's a marketing advantage, a branding advantage to being a leader in that space, no question. We're just about out of time. So the last section was all about planning, and the planning panel I thought was really interesting. Lots of challenges around PD and the production of really poor housing. Paul Higgs mentioned that quite a few times. And the move to looking more at town centre regeneration, I think, is really positive. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I just want to say that I found his presentation on planning gain really interesting. Joking. There's definitely a huge change that's going to happen to town centres, and we need to be aware of it. That's going to hit, and it's going to hit very quickly, and it's unstoppable. And that will create opportunity for new types of development in town centres. Okay. I think the whole PD thing is at least in terms of office to resi, is pretty much done. New opportunities will come up in that area, but I think the real opportunity is in identifying sites which either don't have a planning consent, or for us, this is what we do. We look for sites that have a poor planning consent, a bad one, and then we work on improving it. And actually that's great because it gives us a fallback in the event that things don't go as planned. So there's always something that we can implement. We've got a baseline. But if we get what we want, there's lots of upside, and we like that. And
I completely agree with Iris, talking about sustainability being the future of planning. It is going to be brought in as a condition, isn't it, I think, as part of the planning process.
It already is, and it will become stronger and stronger.
That's it. Time up, I'm afraid. Well, last question then, just in terms of outlook for 2020, what are your thoughts? Are you feeling positive? Are you feeling like we're going to have a great year? What do you think?
I think we're going to have a great year. The residential market, I think, is likely to, I don't think it's going to shoot off, but I think we're going to have a much better year than the last 2 years. For me personally, I've got a great team, really competent, capable, smart people, and we're going to do some great things this year, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Evan. That's it.